in this episode?
There's two kind of facets to keeping people happy. It's obviously the one is like keeping them happy with like resources, with their needs and wants, bread and circus kind of thing. The other one is making them feel like they're represented in their institutions, making them feel like that people in power can listen, they can appeal to them and they'll be listened to, and there aren't like concerted and small groups that can override the concerns of people. That when those two things don't work out, then you get a big wave of discontent. And increasingly in Australia, I think those two are worsening and intensifying um, in how bad they're becoming. So obviously the economic situation isn't particularly great for the average Australian, I think. And increasingly, I think people are having less and less stock or less of a foot in the door in institutions compared to more concerted lobby groups.
Hey everyone, welcome to my conversation with the video essayist and political commentator ActuallyAdu. That's right, given that Adu does cover rather controversial political topics, he does go by a pseudonym. And so if you're listening to this, please do respect his privacy. I do believe to do the kind of work he does, it does require a certain level of anonymity. And on the note of his work, I'm so glad I came across Adu's video essays. I mean, his work is superlative. The production, the research, all of it is on point. In fact, during a conversation, I was even telling him I'm quite pleased with myself to have come across him before he blows up, because I have no doubt with the production quality of his videos, he is going to blow up soon. I'll keep this introduction short. I wanted to get this episode out before the Australian election. And if you're Australian and if you're voting, do consider some of the points that Adu brings up in this podcast before you go and cast your vote on 3rd of May. With that being said, as per usual, a quick PSA. As you may know, I've mentioned multiple times, I'll never have advertisers or sponsors on this podcast. Frankly, I think we live in a society of excess and overconsumption, and I don't want to contribute to that by selling you more things. That being said though, forgive me for the tautology. We, for better or worse, live in the world we live in. I run this podcast on top of doing a full-time job while doing my master's, and if I am to sustain this project, I need some kind of financial backing. So if you have the means, please do consider financially supporting this podcast through Patreon, Substack, or PayPal. All the links will be in the show notes. And if you're wondering, what are the perks? What are you gonna get? The honest answer is nothing. That's right, there's no exclusive behind the paywall perks. You're simply supporting this project if you think the already free content that's publicly available is of any value to you. I sincerely do want to thank the existing supporters on Patreon, Substack, and even PayPal. However, if you're considering supporting the project, please do so only if you have the means. All right, back to the episode.
Anyway.
All right, man. So if I could start by asking you to be Nostradamus here, and perhaps if you've got a bit of a vibe on what the current political scene is, specifically pertaining to the upcoming election. In fact, not next week, week after, right? May 2nd, I think.
Yeah, it's come up quickly.
Yeah, it's going quickly for sure. And yeah, if you've got like an harbinger of what's to come, what's your vibe on the current election? And then, this is probably naive, wishful thinking. Do you think there's a chance for a minority government?
So I think there's been a lot of discontent, a lot of angst towards major parties, but also just political institutions in general, particularly after COVID. I actually think it's more like, although this has kind of waned for a bit now, but for a while I thought that a minority government was actually more likely of the scenarios between a minority government between the Greens and Labor. But we're done just kind of shitting the bed. There could be a Labor majority, but I'm personally hoping for a minority government. I think that would deliver the best outcomes that we can possibly get from this sort of politics anyway. But the vibe is generally pretty big dissatisfaction, even in the rank and file of these major political parties. I think there's a lot of discontent and fractures. So I think, yeah, just a general mood of angst, discontent, disenfranchisement. Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And certainly one thing I want to discuss is because I listened to your podcast, not your interview, not podcast. I forgot the person's name. You
Thoughts
just
After
did it.
Dark, I think it was.
That's it, mate. Yeah,
Or
I mean, you made a
something like
good.
that, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's After Dark. It was a great conversation. And one interesting point you made was this. Look, a lot of this politics it's something a lot more existential over like nerdy policy debates because it's about this lack of meaning you mentioned and
Mm-hmm.
identity and so on. So I do want to discuss that that
Sure.
question, especially pertaining to Australia. But look, man, again, for us politics noobs, what do you mean by minority government? Like, so what I mean by that is like, I guess my understanding here would be uh like Labour and Greens, they combine and they kind of work together. Or is it something like, I mean, the LNP, the coalition party, is actually like a coalition
Yeah.
of like the liberals and the nationalist parties, the right wing parties, right? When you mean a minority government, like practically, what does that entail?
So a minority government is literally just an agreement between a party that has a plurality. So most of the seats, but not a majority, so it can't pass the legislation. In that case, it'll be the Labor Party and whoever the crossbench is, or whoever another minor party is, to get them to that point where they can pass legislation. So in 2010 to 2013, we had a minority government between the Labor Party, the Greens, and a lot of independents, and that was Julia Gillard's government.
Yeah,
So the difference is, yeah, the most productive government, or sorry, the second most productive government in Australian history. Julia Gillard was the most productive prime minister in Australian history because Hawke's first term was more productive, but Hawke, generally speaking, because he had multiple terms, was less productive than Gillard. So yeah, the idea that it wouldn't work because there's too many competing interests just isn't borne out empirically. The difference between that is that the coalition runs consistently together. So in 2010, the Greens and Labor weren't like running together, running against each other. Whereas there's a much more like the Nationals have power within the party room and stuff. There's much more integration, and I'm oversimplifying it, and I'm sure some party nerds will like disagree with what like the characterization, but the general vibe is that the coalition is much more integrated and they're much more unified and consistently one force politically, whereas a minority government only happens in a situation where the major party, in this case the Labor Party, wouldn't get enough seats. The Labor Party wouldn't organize and barter with the Greens if they could just pass through legislation unilaterally. Whereas no matter if they're in opposition or if they're a majority, the coalition are always going to stick together, at least for the foreseeable future. So yeah, that's probably the main difference. It's one's a bit more temporal, a bit more like based on the scenario, based on the situation, what's the next best thing we can do, and one's a bit more of a permanent structure and arrangement between multiple political parties.
Yeah. So, what's your take right now? How do you think the Labour government in the past 3 years they've done? Just generally, I mean, I know we have like more structural problems, which you beautifully outline in your video essays, but I'm just
Thank
talking
you.
like with the conditions we currently have. What's your gauge or vibe on the current Labour government?
I think the Labor government isn't responsible for a lot of the problems we see today because, like you say, they're kind of more structurally embedded. But they are responsible in the sense of they're not doing enough to fix those things. So whether it be housing, whether it be climate change, they're not necessarily responsible, at least this particular Labor government isn't particularly responsible for like cost of living. But they're responsible in the sense that they're not doing enough to combat it. And so they're kind of complicit. And so I think there have been numerous positive aspects of this government. So the expansion of childcare, universalizing childcare, I think that's one of Albanese's greatest achievements. Um, marginally more spending into housing, more attention towards climate change compared to the previous government. Um, Generally speaking, just smaller wins, um, more a more competently run public service, for example. So in the previous government, there was a really big problem with outsourcing to private accounting firms, and that you had a lot of issues with accountability and conflicts of interests with that. And now one of the positive things I think this government's doing, which it's getting a lot of flack for, is expanding the public service and using public sector job growth as a means to combat a potential recession. I think that's a positive thing, not only because we want to rebuild our public service, but because it's a good way to avoid a recession. So I think there have been positives that this government has done. I think if the Liberals were in this position, they would have managed it much worse. Having said that, again, kind of circling back to that thing of, well, they're managing a situation where there's a lot of structurally stuffed up things. They're not really doing a lot. They're not really seizing the moment and being ambitious. Now, there are things that they have done wrong, which have directly contributed to the problems we're seeing. So if we want to talk about climate change, continuing to expand and fund fossil fuel projects, that kind of stuff, that obviously they're doing a bad thing, that's going to have implications for the future. But generally speaking, I think this government's more been a government of complicity as opposed to acting just overtly badly.
Yeah, no, well said, well said. So, and that point you made about Timmy Trump, aka Peter Dutton, him wanting to do like a Doge in Australia.
Yeah.
It's like kind of what like is it what ScoMo did, where you cut all the uh the public sector, you reduce the public sector, but of course the work nonetheless has to get done, and then that goes to the private sector consulting company firms, and as a result of that, it costs the taxpayer more, right? So it's just
it costs them more. There's really big
uh,
like conflicts of interest. So obviously the big one was a PwC with it, telling its own clients how it was structuring, tax arrangements and whatever. But it's really broad, because even like the previous government's climate modeling, which for a while the Albanese government relied on for their goals, was done by McKinsey, and McKinsey is like infamous for being tied to the fossil fuel industry. So like it's very, very and this wasn't just a ScoMo thing. This was like a Liberal Party thing since Abbott, slowly eroding away at the public service, and you can even trace back to Howard in some respects. So
yeah, I think
a very like continual
neoliberalism, right?
That idea that the private sector is actually more efficient, and so we just need to cull the public service, ignoring the negative externalities and the public good that it serves. So, I think that one of the good things that Albo's done is started to rectify that. Has he done it perfectly? No, obviously not. But comparatively, I think it is on the right track.
Yeah, and I certainly want to get into these more, let's call it theoretical, structural, not theoretical in like an abstract sense, theoretical in a very material sense, issues which you cover in your video essays. Because like, I think you make an interesting point that, again, I'm referring to the previous interview you had. Like a lot of people talk about these things like, I don't know, just had like a day-to-day kind of the spectacle of politics. But then I like that you say that where you try to place yourself is if you have a funnel, people are interested in these things either because politics is like entertainment, or through genuine just people feeling disenfranchised and anxious and just economic anxiety, and they're like, what the hell's going on? And then what you want is you want to try and provide something more in the let's call it the more structural side of the funnel, where like, okay, these things can't be solved with like little tweaks here and there.
Yeah,
we have to make some fundamental changes. But look, I really want to touch on them when we discuss housing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
But I'm glad you mentioned this whole thing about neoliberalism and kind of how both parties really are complicit. And what I want to discuss now is, man, this is really a big thing for me, because it's something that I didn't realize how deeply entrenched it is to the Australian political scene, all the way from like Bob Hawke's time, from that time. But it's the influence of the U.S. on Australian politics,
Yep.
and just how much there's this nexus between the U.S. And Australia, and then of course even the UK with AUKUS, all of that. You have a great essay on that too. But let me just put it this way. Let me put the question this way. Yeah, generally, can you talk a bit about just the historical influence by the US in Australian politics, but then also more contemporarily, uh, the influence of kind of the MAGA movement and I'm sorry, man. To go on a tangent, I really cringe when I see
No.
like Australians wear like the MAGA hat. I'm like, what are
Oh,
you
it's
doing?
horrible. No,
It
it's
just
so
makes me
bad.
like throw up inside. But anyway, so the in like the contemporary scene, the influence of the MAGA movement on Australian politics. So sorry again, bipartite
No,
question.
yeah.
Historic and then more contemporary.
I just a side tangent. I don't know if you know who Rukshan is, the real Rukshan.
Oh, bro, I do know who he is.
Bro, you see him? He wore the
Bro,
fucking MAGA hat.
yellow.
Oh
Yeah.
my god, yeah, it's so, the libertarian is a libertarian. They're so ugly. The yellow shit. Oh my god, it's so, like, come on, get some. If you're gonna whole like if your whole stick is like, oh, the private market does things better, get better clothing, man. It
I
looks
know, bro.
horrible,
Yeah.
like
Like get
far
like a
out.
proper designer or something that
Yeah.
looks
Oh, it looks like
done by.
the hoodies, the tight hoodies with the button up shirts. Oh, it's dreadful. It's dreadful. And the yellow is disgusting.
Yeah, I know,
It's
man.
so
Like
bad.
the whole libertarian thing, right? Oh,
Yeah. But
ridiculous.
anyway, um, yeah, I do want to say that when people talk about the US and Australia and that kind of relationship, what is often unsaid is the role of local Australian elites in facilitating that and also replicating um, oppressive or um, hierarchical relations here at home, even without the pressure of foreign influence, right? So, um, with that being said, there is this kind of nexus that goes back beyond Hawke. But Hawke was kind of, I think, a big turning point in terms of really getting what was left of any kind of anti-American imperialism that was in Australia and sort of kind of cajoling it into, not, that's not the right word, dissipating it. Um, the words used by the CIA at the time was a little here, little there approach, where they would get their friends in these high positions in the trade union movement, in the Labour Party, and slowly kind of reorientate it to the point where it would suit US interests enough. It didn't have to be, a full reorientation like the Liberal Party, but it did it enough to the point where it wasn't a threat anymore. And that to me was a big turning point because that coincided with the global shift towards more neoliberal economics, or globalization, free trade, that kind of stuff. So that stuff's all intertwined. The behavior and interests of local elites, and then the nexus between that and foreign influence, and then kind of trying to exert influence in as many different facets as possible. It's a very interlinked and big web. So and that's kind of continued to this day. Obviously, its modern manifestation is AUKUS, and I think that, look, in terms of the MAGA stuff, I think that's not a real big significant play in Australian politics in terms of its relationship to America. I think really where America's influence politically in Australia comes out to play is in like security stuff. So most security stuff is basically bipartisan. AUKUS was bipartisan.
Yeah,
You'll be hard pressed to find a significant deviation in the Liberal Party's and the Labor Party's defense policies. Any kind of Chinese infiltration to kind of counter US influence really is dead in the water in both parties. I mean, you had Sam Dastyari in like 2014 or whatever, and you had like Gladys Liu in like 29. Like, it's just non-existent anymore. Both parties, that I think is where really US politics really influences Australia, is the security scene. But in terms of like the MAGA stuff, I really don't think there's a real connect here in Australia as much.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, like MAGA for me, it really is a cultural movement, right? It's a cult. It's the ultimate vibes-based politics. I mean, look at Joe Rogan, for instance, you
Yeah.
know? So, I mean, it's
I think
yeah,
there is a growth in, as I said before, there's a growth in discontent, a growth in post-truth politics in Australia. But I think MAGA and then the different kind of nationalisms in Europe, that's a lot different than what we're seeing in Australia. We're not really seeing that kind of level of national conservatism. We're seeing the underpinnings for it. We're seeing the you
I
know
agree.
the discontent, the disenfranchisement, that kind of stuff. We're seeing the underpinnings, but we're not seeing it formulate into a central political movement. Even if you look at all our far right parties, they're all squabbling amongst each other. Like the Trumpet of Patriots are caught out by another political party for preferencing Labor, but like they all hate each other. Um, so there's not really like a big kind of central movement to kind of bring all these people together and then expand it in Australia. Certainly the feelings are there, but in terms of organization and manifestation, it's just not on the same level as MAGA or like the European nationalist political parties. It's not as fleshed out. It's just not as developed, I think would be the best way to put it. But
And
certainly the kind of certainly the environment is ripe for it, I think. Increasingly so anyway.
what do you mean by that? Elaborate, please.
Well, if we say that, where MAGA came from was a big shift away from politics as usual, people feeling like the institutions that they elect representatives to aren't actually representing them and aren't actually representing their interests, they're going to turn to, politics that may be unscrupulous otherwise, or they're going to be like, this institution is telling me this thing that why, like they're not acting in my interest. I'm going to believe in this truth, and then like I'm going to believe in this thing. I'm going to believe in this conspiracy theory. People get disenfranchised and they fall into that kind of populist right politics because the current system, current institutions aren't doing it for them. They aren't doing enough to satisfy their needs and wants, and they're not. People don't feel like they have a stake, or they don't feel like they're being represented by these institutions and systems. And so, yeah, they're going to turn to alternative movements and whatever, or alternative figures. It's just in Australia we haven't seen that develop as much, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Again, thank God for that. I mean, look, it's clear that the liberals are trying to borrow things from the MAGA movement. Like I saw these scare campaign
Oh, definitely,
brochures
yeah.
being shared, calling people woke. I mean, I've literally I had a conversation recently. I'm not going to mention any names, and she was telling me that I can't take Elbow. He's too woke. And then I was like, well, what do you define? What do you mean by woke?
Hmm.
And she was like, oh, it's weak. So I was like, so weak as well, because like it's kind of what I mean. Like so much of modern politics is vibes-based politics, and
There is a
this
bit
is
of
what
that cultural stuff.
yeah, exactly. And this is what
Yeah.
really infuriates me about more of the Murdoch media propaganda. Like all they really do is they just constantly uh, divide people, but also constantly just have these scare campaigns and just try to constantly portray, Labor, left, whoever, as like these, I don't know, communist, Stalinist, evil, Marxist, postmodern, neo-Marxist Satanists. But then if you look at like what they're offering, they offer nothing apart from, I don't know, privatize everything in nuclear energy. So I guess a part of what I want to get through in this conversation, man, is like apart from like the day-to-day party politics, just like what you do in your video essays, which is like, okay, can we take a step back and kind of philosophically discuss what fundamental changes we as a nation need to,
Hmm.
in fact, become a better country? I mean, no country's a utopia, but look, we are still compared to most of the world. I mean, I can say this as a migrant here. It's pretty damn good, right? It's a pretty amazing, beautiful,
Yeah,
multicultural
comparatively, yeah.
country. I mean, we have problems for sure, but it's not hell yet. Yet being a good keyword there. Um, Yeah, all right, man. On that note, and also, by the way, I think towards the end of the conversation, I'm gonna again get back to more of the. I want to discuss a bit of the policy stuff and
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
how people should approach this upcoming election, while also discussing preferential voting. But I think, in the interest of time, let's get to your specific video essays. So the first one I want to discuss, and I'll leave a link to all of these in the show notes, is the one decommodify housing. So again, two questions, right? First
Mhm.
of all, what is the housing crisis in Australia as you see it? And secondly, what do you mean by decommodify housing? And keep in mind, this is for someone who has no idea, like hasn't looked much into economics and
Yep.
kind of all of that, just for a neophyte. Yeah, if you could start from there, I do.
So the housing crisis in Australia today is basically prices have increased to the point where it's become, nearly unobtainable to really hope to buy a house. Like it's just not feasible for many people, particularly young people. So, and that's increasingly become a thing for the past 20, 30 odd years. Now, there are a lot of crises surrounding that. So there's crises in the building industry, the residential building industry. There's crises in terms of, if you want to call the amount of speculative demand. So speculative being you have an item or an asset and people, bid up the price increasingly, bid it up, and increasingly jack up the price. But yeah, fundamentally what it comes down to is that prices are just too out of reach for people, and it's just gotten to such a point where we're kind of known for it, and home ownership as a result has begun to decline. So in terms of decommodifying housing, currently a house isn't just your house. It's also most people's biggest asset. It's their biggest source of their net worth. So people, when they own a house, even if they're just like a regular person, employee that has a job, they're incentivized to want their asset, their biggest portion of their net worth, to increase in value. Now, when you have 60, 70% of the population that think and act like that and have that vested interest in the system, a system of continual price growth, it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy where the previous generation, they bought their house and then they would vote for, campaign for, support policies that would make it easier to increase the value of their home. For the next generation, sure, the previous one, they got to increase the value of their home and maybe pass it down to their kids. But for the next generation, increasing value in your home means higher prices. And particularly when wages aren't growing like that, that means it's increasingly out of reach for people. So decommodifying, that's commodifying housing. Decommodifying housing is basically saying we want to break that circuit. We want to break that relationship completely. We want housing not to be like a stock you have in the stock market, but more like a personal item you own, like a toothbrush or a mug, right? Or even a car, right? Cars aren't necessarily speculative all the time. In fact, they depreciate over time. So that's kind of the bread and butter of decommodification. Instead of treating your house like an asset or a stock or a share that is supposed to increase over time, that comprises the majority of your net worth, housing instead is a personal item that you own that fulfills your needs and wants, and broadly speaking, fulfills the community's needs and wants. So that's kind of what decommodifying
And not
housing is.
just a nice to have, an essential need, because at the end of the day, I mean,
Oh, you
it's
need a
so
roof over your head, yeah.
you literally need a roof over your head, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. Okay, so this is a term you use in the essay. You say there's a fundamental contradiction when it comes to housing in Australia. And is what you mean by this what you kind of just described, this notion of, yeah, that housing, we have people who need houses to like live in, like people like me who are renting literally just a roof over my head. But at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, our system, both structurally and culturally, is set up as such that housing is seen as an asset, like a stock in the stock market.
Yeah, so on one hand, you have a majority of the population in this country and our entire economy at this point, because remember that banks trade off the confidence of the housing market because it's one of the biggest biggest source of their loans. So our economy is dependent on the housing market performing well, generally speaking. The majority of the population depend on their nest egg or their biggest asset performing well. That's one side of it that want prices to increase. The other side, the people who the people who want to buy homes, typically younger people, the coming generations, they want house prices to be as low as possible so they can enter the market. This is a contradictory position. People who are selling, people who are holding onto their assets, they want their price to increase. They want their value of their stock to increase. People who are buying, increasingly younger people, you and I, we don't want those prices to be that high. Now, where it gets tricky is that typically when we have a market, right, that contradiction is natural. You're the seller, you're selling me a toothbrush, you want to sell it as high as possible. I want to buy it, I'm going to buy that toothbrush for as low as possible. We meet in the middle. Theoretically speaking, very simply, right? When it comes to housing, because our economy is so centered around the price growth of real estate, it's a completely uneven relationship, particularly when still a majority of the population, 60%, have a vested interest in house prices growing. Again, banks do, our financial institutions, the government does, if it doesn't want economic ruin. So that's why I say it's contradictory. And I think it's contradictory to a point where it's harmful, because increasingly you're kind of having like a K-shape result where one side is increasingly getting wealthier and wealthier, and the other side is increasingly becoming less and less able to enter the market. And we actually saw this happen before in Australia. We saw this come to a head in the 1890s. It's actually our worst depression on record, the 1890s, and it was the result of our economy collapsing under the weight of this incredibly speculative period where house prices or land prices more back then, were increasing at incredible rates. And simultaneously, we had comparatively high home ownership rates compared to the rest of the world. Now, back then, we didn't have nearly the same financial stability or institutional stability. So there was no lender of last resort. There was no central government. It was much more free-for-all, free market, that kind of vibe. But we've kind of regressed, because after that fact and after the Great Depression, we kind of clamped down on that behavior. But then now we've kind of begun to reintroduce some of those aspects of, relying on a speculative land market to uplift the economy or underpin the economy. So this has happened before. And it ended spectacularly in the worst way possible in our worst depression. So that's what I mean by it's contradictory, and it will come to a head at some point, and it will be catastrophic.
Indeed, the way there'll be like could be, I don't know, we don't know what it is, but either a revolution or an explosion in that sense, yeah.
Well, in the 1890s, there was nearly a revolution. It was open class warfare, to quote some of the literature in that respect. You literally had governments sending in cannons, infantry detachments. You had captains of industry, whether it be the railways, the pastoralists, the industrialists, by the way, who previously hated each other, now in an alliance to crush striking workers and crush any kind of revolt. It was very nearly a revolution. And that's where the Labour Party came from, because they thought that the failures of that revolution or the strikes to eventually, bring something new and better was evidence that that kind of revolutionary approach was bust, and instead they decided to go for a parliamentary route. And so that's what created the Labour Party. So yeah, it's interesting to kind of reflect on what has happened before, and history rhymes. So who knows? What that has in store for us.
That, man. History for sure rhymes. I mean, I gotta say, I'm glad you used the term contradiction, because in that video essay, you beautifully kind of elucidate how this can be fixed with little tweaks here and there, because we do have a fundamental contradiction in our society, the way it's structured right now. And I mean, to be fair, I don't even think it's just Australia. It's neoliberalism. It's kind of treating.
Oh, absolutely. It's not unique to Australia.
Yeah.
It's not unique to Australia. What is unique to Australia is how how far we've gone in that direction, and how much specifically our economy is dependent on price growth and real estate. So other economies are a bit more diverse in specifically what they've invested in. Their home ownership rates aren't nearly as big. Australia is particularly unique in this way, but not like unique in the sense that it's only happening to us, and we're the only ones with this contradiction. We're just like uniquely bad at it. Like that's kind of the problem. But
Yeah.
100%, it's a hallmark feature of global society, global everywhere
Capitalism.
basically. Yeah,
Yeah.
clap it. Yeah,
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned economic diversity, man. So like, I think I really do want to touch on this. I was reading this. It's an article, I think, that we have an economic diversity less than, I think, even Uganda,
hmm
which is, as they say, a developing country. And for a rich nation like ours, it puts us in a very precarious position where we are overly reliant on generally one industry, and that's the mining industry. So can you talk a bit about just what has the mining industry done to Australia? And then can you talk about how, yeah, as a nation, as an economy, let's say, we do have very little economic diversity.
There was a really good video made on this by this guy called Nick's Takeaway. Um, and there is this idea that Australia needs to diversify, and that it's bad that we're on par with developing countries like Uganda or whatever. I actually don't think it's that big of a deal. And the reason why is that talking about diversity in this respect only talks about exports. So obviously our biggest exports is mining. A big part of our revenue is mining. But even when you're talking about like GDP, right? The number one industry or number one sector in Australia is services. It's not mining. Mining
And
makes up like 8% of GDP or something, which is not nothing, but it's not, you know, 70%. So this idea that Australia isn't economically diverse domestically, I think, sorry, it ignores the domestic economy, which is quite diverse. Now, I think the reason there's a bit of a correlation causation fallacy going on when people talk about, this is my opinion anyway, when people talk about the correlation between developing countries and diversity, economic diversity. Typically, those developing countries, they've been kind of fashioned into that way before they became those, before that's what their export profiles were. So countries like Uganda or a lot of African countries, they were like colonial outposts. That's what they were for, right? Australia was a settler colony, right? British came here and set up their own society in the current and expanded it, right? And created their own little mini metropole. I think that historical difference is really the key difference there. Where in like Africa, in like South America or Asia or wherever, before these were kind of, the metropole was going out to the periphery and kind of extracting it and had a very little outpost there. In Australia, it's very different, where they set up their own little replication of British society here. And so the relationship between the metropole and Australia is very different between the metropole and, let's say, Uganda or like Central Africa. And I think that is much more influential than simply the economic profile of the export profile of a particular country. That's my opinion anyway. So I actually you know, came across this in the literature as well. That this idea that economic diversity isn't necessarily the be all and end all in terms of a country's success. And I mean, we've done pretty well, despite having a relatively pretty mining orientated export profile.
that's very interesting. I didn't think, because for me, I always thought nations that are quite prosperous would generally have a high economic diversity. I mean, I haven't looked into the literature the way you have, of course, but I was thinking of the US, for instance. They probably have a pretty high economic diversity, or maybe I'm wrong there.
There's definitely a correlation and probably a relationship there, but I think fully owing it to that or putting a lot of weight or stock in that view, I think really misses out on that historical context and those relationships, those colonial relationships, how different they were from Australia to Uganda.
Indeed.
I think those are real. That's really important as well. Certainly, I think that there has to be a relationship. Obviously, it makes economic sense that this whole, like the whole thing about Dutch disease and whatever, right? It's like, oh, if you only pursue this one resource industry, then yeah, when it goes bust, your whole economy is going to go bust. But I really think that the historical aspect has really informed the story as well. So I'm not throwing out the baby with the bathwater per se. I'm just saying there is more, I think, to the story than simply economic diversity on the export side of things. Because again, Australia internally is actually quite diverse.
All right, I need to look more into this. Thank you, man. That's
Nick's
something.
takeaways does a good video on it. If I don't know if you've heard of him, but
No, no, I
um,
haven't. I'll put an overlay when I'm editing the episode. Great, and I'll look it up too. So, all right, man. Just on the note, perhaps a bit of a segue. I want to discuss manufacturing.
yeah,
The reason being, one thing I gotta say that I really liked is this Future Made in Australia initiative by the Labor government. And it looked really nice to me, like, creating a manufacturing industry in Australia, of course, sustainable energy. It felt like a win-win. So I guess more at like a philosophical level again, in terms of what makes a nation prosperous. Yeah, how do you think we are doing as it pertains to Australian manufacturing? And when I mean manufacturing, I actually mean building and creating things, not just like sucking things out of our land like the way the coal and mining industry is doing,
mm.
and then like selling them off to some country. So yeah, one more philosophical question: is manufacturing, a strong and powerful manufacturing industry, necessary for a nation to prosper? And a second one, more policy-oriented one, or let's say a practical one. What are your thoughts on something like the Future Made in Australia initiative by really the Labor government?
So the whole this kind of focus on manufacturing was really evident in the developmental state model that was employed by a lot of the Asian tigers, so Indonesia, Malaysia, Japan, South Korea, Singapore. Oh, not as much Singapore, but basically where you had heavy state intervention, lots of tariffs, um, that kind of stuff where you really, really focus on developing a local domestic manufacturing industry and then use that to kind of, make products and specialize to get to the point where you become advanced enough to then offshore that stuff yourself. So I think I kind of echo Marx in this regard, where he kind of calls the bourgeoisie a band of warring brothers. Or was it Engels? I don't know. Anyway,
I think that was Engels, right?
it might have been. I don't know. I can't remember specifically. One of them said it. The bourgeoisie is a band of warring brothers, and that kind of like manufacturing section of the ruling class, and then you kind of have the more free traders and financial wizards, and then you have more like services orientated. Like I really think that in the grand scheme of things, focusing on like putting all of our eggs in one particular basket in terms of reforming or revolutionizing how we do things, changing capitalism, in the grand scheme of things, it's not necessarily where I want to focus my antagonism. I do think, though, that the consequences of the proliferation of neoliberalism in Australia was the decimation of our manufacturing sector. And one key consequence of that was the erasure of good paying, secure, permanent, or not permanent, full-time employment. And the services industry and the gig economy has not been able to replicate that whatsoever. So in that respect, I think manufacturing has an edge. However, I think broadly speaking, this idea that manufacturing is like inherently less exploitative, and if we make the stuff here at home, it's like better than if it was made overseas. That doesn't resonate with me per se, particularly as like an internationalist. I don't think Australia as a nation is particularly uniquely equipped to do this stuff or whatever. I do think that kind of attitude is helpful when developing and industrializing a country. So again, that kind of developmental model employed by us, but then also later the Asian tigers, that can work at industrializing a country pretty quickly, pretty rapidly. Whether we then go back and then embrace, like try and re-embrace that stuff, but also keeping the same structures and way of doing things, which kind of made it so it disappeared to begin with. I don't know. I don't know how feasible it is. I mean, look, I've done a bit of looking into the Australia, future made in Australia stuff. I don't disagree with like most of it. I think making, trying to increase Australia's role in making renewable energy and the parts of renewable energy. That's like a positive. I have no problem with that whatsoever. I guess the issue I have is that like, oh, if we do this, then like we're going to solve all these problems around like employment and whatever. And I think that's kind of mistaken. But I've got no opposition to making things in Australia, like principally. Um, I guess the only other thing is that part of the manufacturing stuff, bringing that back to Australia, does include the military stuff, which I'm not a huge fan of, obviously. But yeah, I think, yeah, a general kind of ambivalence and a bit of a questioning as to whether this is the particular front we should be spending our time on. But still, in regards to like the renewable stuff, I think it is, there's no problem on my end.
Certainly, the whole military stuff is a whole other can of worms, and maybe we'll discuss that on another episode. But
Yeah.
so again, Aju, just to clarify and really hone in on this point, right? I guess what I took from that is, which I completely agree, by the way, that just because we bring back manufacturing jobs back home, so to speak, whatever that means, and we like build a thriving manufacturing industry in Australia, which is going to be good, probably a lot more stable compared to the gig economy that we currently have. That doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to have these like idyllic, beautifully unionized jobs where they're going to be able to negotiate with their employers, and they're going to, like simply just bringing back jobs home again won't solve some of these issues you outlined, are issues imminent to neoliberal capitalism.
If you think about it, right, and I brought this up a while ago in one of my videos, but the reason why neoliberalism kind of came about was the failure for social democracy and the failure for these more manufacturing at home kind of countries. Because in the 70s, you kind of got to this point where the contradictions between class became so prevalent and so obvious. The rate of profit was in a free fall. Stagflation was a really big problem for capitalist economies, developed capitalist economies. And so neoliberalism was a reaction to that. Because on one hand, you had an increasingly militant working class, an increasingly unionized working class, who were predominantly in these kind of blue collar manufacturing, construction, build this at home kind of industries. Yet that kind of focus didn't stop the tide turning to neoliberalism. If anything, it produced it. So re-antagonizing on those fronts again to kind of bring Australia back to a more protectionist, building our stuff more at home. Like even let's say it does bring back the level of unionization that it did, in the 70s. You're still not resolving those contradictions and those problems, which cause neoliberalism to emerge as a reaction from the ruling elite to begin with. So again, I think on a policy level, it has its uses in regards to the renewable stuff, but as like a strategy to like really improve people's lives or to introduce any kind of radical or revolutionary change, again, I don't think it's particularly useful to antagonize or focus on those particular fronts of whether we are more free trade or protectionist or whatever.
Indeed, indeed. And I would also argue that, especially the world we live in right now, that like nationalism has no place. It's impossible for us to be a nationalistic nation. It's gonna affect us in a negative way, and I'd say on principle, nationalism doesn't work, but also just due to the contingent factors of what our world is right now, nationalism, as I think we'll see from what Trump does, it just doesn't work for a nation. I mean, we need some kind of. Here's where, I mean, as much as I'm sure you, especially as you would have criticisms of like the EU and the UN, I still very much believe in these global organizations amongst nation states.
Oh, I mean, my problem with like the EU or whatever is that it focuses only on Europe, and two, it's not interested in it's globalist. It's not internationalist. Internationalist. There's the distinction I think there is more internationalism. You want to break down the relationships and structures between different countries. Globalism, you kind of want to embrace what the global community is right now and kind of have these kind of institutions on top of that. So
So
my
that you
problem with
get
the
free trade and all of that. I see
yeah,
what
that kind of stuff. Yeah, I think that's probably my biggest problem with like the EU or whatever. Not from a nationalist perspective, certainly not.
That's fair. That's a fair point. All right. So the other thing I want to discuss is, in fact, no. Before we get here, I want to talk about your video, the nuclear power fallacy. Great, well balanced take, man. I really enjoyed that. I even shared it with my partner. I was like, "This is a
Oh
good
wow.
take, nuclear power," because, especially because like yourself, I like. In principle, I've never been anti-nuclear. I always thought that was a silly thing. Why would you just kind of almost dogmatically be anti-nuclear?
Yeah.
But before we get to that, again, at a high level, man, I don't know how to even ask this question, but yeah, everyone talks about inflation, the cost of living crisis, and personally, I too feel it. Like I mean, I get by, I have savings, all of that, but of course, I too feel the economic anxiety of like losing my job. I was made redundant 6 or 7 months ago, and it sucks, man. Like it's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
super stressful. And thankfully I found another job. So, but that being said, though, I don't know. Maybe it's a stupid bit of view. This like I'm not someone in Gaza, right? Like like my life is still okay. I can
Yeah.
have these silly podcasts, without like bombs on my head.
Yeah.
So I guess my question would be like, in terms of the cost of living crisis and all these things about how we are having economic problems, how bad is it for Australia, really? Like in your view, what's your vibe on it? Like compared to rest of the so-called developed world, are we at the bottom rung of the ladder, or like somewhere in the middle? Like how do you see it? Like high level.
So if you compare our it's either real wages or GDP per capita, one of the two. I forget which one specifically, but if you compare one of those two to the OECD, which is like a group of 30 developed countries or whatever, we've actually lagged quite below. So in terms of that, yes, we are in comparison to similar economies, we have actually lagged in that respect, which again I think is a result of inaction on the part of the current government, as opposed to like them doing policies which are, proactively making it worse. I think they're just not acting enough, nearly enough, which you could say is an action in and of itself. But you get what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
I think in some ways Australia has it uniquely bad. So again, in terms of housing, I think the Australian example is uniquely precarious. I think in terms of real wage declines, I think we've seen real wages decline more so and for longer than it did in other countries. But again, we do still have a comparatively high standard of living, even compared to other developed countries that may have seen real wages grow or GDP per capita grow. So it isn't the end of the world. The important thing, again, is that not people. There's two kind of facets to keeping people happy. It's obviously the one is like keeping them happy with like resources, with their needs and wants, bread and circus kind of thing. The other one is making them feel like they're represented in their institutions, making them feel like that people in power can listen, they can appeal to them and they'll be listened to, and there aren't like concerted and small groups that can override the concerns of people. That when those two things don't work out, then you get a big wave of discontent. And increasingly in Australia, I think those two are worsening and intensifying in how in how bad they're becoming. So obviously the economic situation isn't particularly great for the average Australian, I think. And increasingly, I think people are having less and less stock or less of a foot in the door in institutions compared to more concerted lobby groups or whatever. But obviously, it's always good to put it in perspective. You know, we live relatively shielded, peaceful lives compared to, as you say, someone in Gaza or someone in Sudan or someone in the Congo or, you know, someone in Myanmar. Like, comparatively, we have it pretty good. And it's always good to acknowledge that, yes, while we Australians do suffer under the current system, ultimately we are beneficiaries. Ultimately, our standard of living is upheld by the blood of the people in the global south and in the developing world. So
Yeah,
it's always good to kind of put that in perspective, I think,
yeah.
100%.
I have to admit, man, like, a bit embarrassing, but when I was younger, I was actually quite more on the right. I would say I was like one of these. I even used to, watch that idiot Jordan Peterson and all that crap. So, and I'm now, that I've become pretty much a leftist, probably even a communist. I don't know. I realized like there's something really, what's the word I'm looking for here? Cathartic or psychologically soothing in being on the right, because it's amazing how well we justify the conditions of a society. So this point you just made, that yeah, the world that we enjoy today as Australians here, it's built on the massacre, on the blood of others. Historically, of course, the First Nations people, but also even currently with all these Uganda, Congo, Gaza, and all of this, and just acknowledging that it can be, I don't know, at like a very existential level, it can be really difficult to carry that weight. So I can see
For
why
sure.
people move towards the right. Number one, when there are all the contradictions of our society, and you feel that anxiety, but at the same time, we don't want to acknowledge the fact that the world is a pretty grim and dark place, and yeah, it's probably always been the case. As what's this? Joseph Conrad. He wrote that really good book. And uh, yeah. Okay. Be
Yeah.
that as it may, I'm
I,
not trying to.
I,
Hey,
I,
go ahead. Sorry.
it is, I don't necessarily know if it's easier to be on the right per se, because I think there is a lot of just like constantly trying to find things to complain about. Like, I was looking on social media the other day, and people were complaining that a Muslim reporter was covering the Pope's death on Nine News. I'm sorry,
Oh man.
who gives a shit? Oh my God, you have to be so coddled to actually care about that. Like, or like when Albanese said, "Happy Easter" with a picture of his dogs, and then for I don't know if it was for what was it for? Ramadan or something, or Eid or whatever. Like, it was some kind of Islamic holiday. He like made a ministerial statement, like, and people were like up, like, all these conservatives were like making a fuss. I'm like, like far out. It must be so, just
It's
terrible
been
to
like
live
a
your life in such
whinging
constant
and
interpersonal
complaining.
negativity. Yeah,
Yeah,
and like,
resentful. Yeah.
because I think there's a fundamental, like, there's a difference there where I think you're right in saying it is quite grim and depressing sometimes to have those kind of that kind of perspective where it's like, yeah, my life could be better, and yeah, I suffer as well, but me, my material comfort is really, really just upheld by the blood, sweat, and tears and labor of millions of people in the global south. That's a really depressing thought, and it's like, how do you even fix that? Where do you even start, right? On a practical level.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but like,
Yeah, good point.
interpersonally, like, because that's like a more systemic kind of like criticism, right? I don't think anyone should feel particularly bad or like guilty about being, white or Australian or whatever.
Of course not.
I think that's been counterproductive.
Yeah.
But like, this interpersonal, just like negativity and constantly searching and just trying to derive as much just negativity out of anything remotely, like, anything remotely to do with like culture or anything, just has to be a reflection of these people's mental state. It just sucks. It just seems like it sucks to be like that.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah, you
know.
make that's a pretty perspicacious point, because like, I think when you come to the more of what I would call the leftist view of things, when you see these structural problems, you realize I'm not gonna whinge and complain about Anthony Albanese, I don't know, doing something for Ramadan or whatever with a dog during Easter. Who gives a shit, right? I mean,
It's so, oh my God. And
like
like
life, yeah.
literally tens of thousands of
Pathetic.
likes as well. I'm sorry. What the it it actually pissed me off how much people cared. And I'm like, come on.
Yeah.
Do something with your lives. But no.
That's what I mean, bro. I always say this, bro. Like, whenever I see people complain about, like, especially like the anti-trans stuff, I've been saying it's
Oh yeah.
disgusting, right? I mean, this is not
I
just
don't know.
Australia, all
I
over
don't know
the
if
world, right?
I don't
It's
know if you
terrible. And I'm
I
like,
don't know
get
if
a
you've been
life,
keeping
you creeps. You
yeah.
know, like
I don't know if you've been keeping tabs with like my short-term content or short
the shorts on
content.
YouTube. Yeah, I do see them.
But I made a little video on the guy who went on Q&A, Morgan Cox.
Oh, bro, yeah, bro. I had no idea. I was watching that Q&A. He was like a part of some weird far right party, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, I go on his Twitter and like I go into his replies and stuff, and he's saying that he spent his money that he said he was on the brink of homelessness and he's one rent increase away from homelessness. He said he spent his money on this trailer and spent it all on like this protest. And then someone was like, "Oh, what are you doing for Easter?" And he's like, "I'm doing this for Easter. Instead of going to see my family and spending time with them, I'm doing this." And I'm like, I'm so like, holy it just seems so sad. Like far out. I feel bad. Almost.
Yeah, I mean, and you let
For
that
that guy in
consume
particular.
your life. It's just, yeah. I mean,
It
and don't get me
unfortunately I
wrong,
think
man. I am. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
sorry. I was just gonna say like I genuinely do feel bad for a lot of these people. Some of these people I think are genuinely just grifting and I couldn't care less. I think it's just a sad reflection of their state. But I think a majority of those kind of people I do genuinely feel bad for because it is just like a trap that you've fallen into as a result of genuine concerns and problems with our society, but you've just kind of gone down the wrong path. But there is a lot of grift, unfortunately, as well.
Yeah. Mate, I mean, I'm saying this because I mean, I experienced this. Like, I knew when I was probably 19. I was in Melbourne, in fact. So I was studying at Swinburne. 18 or 19, I fell down the Jordan Peterson whole thing, and I was like, anti-feminism. And
Yeah,
the thing is, it's part of it is because you're trying to deal with the uncertainty of existence. Like this is something a lot more existential, which touches on politics. But the second thing is, yeah, in a way, you kind of start enjoying the complaining too. You kind of like the whinging. It's a worse kind of way to enjoy life. But you kind of get this weird sort of pleasure from constantly, So
mm.
and like, complaining about feminists or what was this thing? Woke and some or DEI and all this stuff. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's pathetic, man. But I think you're right in the sense that like I one thing I would never ever do is like in this condescending way dismiss people when they even if they have completely different views, right wing views to me. Because some people they genuinely do believe it and they really it's like they've really bought into this worldview as the solution to their problems when we all know that most of these things are material and that I don't know. Uh,
I've really made an effort on my channel to not be like that. There is
yeah,
a really big tendency
I can
on
see that, man.
left
I can
side
see
of
that.
politics to kind of dismiss it all and be uh, a bit like, oh, you're just a racist asshole, you're evil, which like I understand and I get, and a lot of it is. However, I think sometimes, and a lot of times actually, that kind of attitude is a bit counterproductive if that's our only strategy in media output. So that's where I was like, you know what? Like, I'm not gonna. I don't think I've called any of the people that I've like called out or talked about racist at all. Even if I think some of them are, I've never really been like, this person's a racist. You should never engage with them because they're a bigot. And again, I might think that. I might agree with people who say that. But I think there is a space for actually engaging with it because it is increasingly becoming more and more of a problem. So, and particularly when you have that side of politics represented in the most powerful government in the world, I think it's you kind of have to reconcile with it a bit and give something other than dismissive attitudes and just waving it away as racism and bigotry. Again, not saying I disagree entirely, just that we have to kind of diversify our strategy a bit in that respect. So
Yeah.
I do try and not be super, snobby and high-minded and ivory tower-esque. Which, look, I think I've failed at. I think I could do a lot better. I think there are things I could do better. I think that my message can come across better in some instances. I think a lot of times I come across as like an ivory tower academic that's, beckoning down to the populace and telling them what's what. And I don't want to be like that. But I do think I have made a bit of progress in trying to change things up a bit. So it's not all doom and gloom, but yeah,
But
I don't know.
man, I would also say this, right? I mean, I've probably watched all of your video essays, and you never come off as like the finger wagging kind of person. However, that being said, the other side of condescension or patronizing or being
Is like
patronizing
overly dumbing down things.
is
Yeah.
overly dumbing down the
Yeah.
bigotry of low expectations.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, just don't think people are stupid. People aren't stupid. People are stupid. Most humans are stupid at most things, but people aren't not totally stupid. Let's just put it that way. People still can like some of these things.
Yeah.
The thing is these things we consider academic ivory tower stuff. They can be explained and understood at a very day-to-day phenomenological way. Like, I mean, when someone speaks of inequality or the housing crisis, like everyone knows what that feels like, and because we all do experience it. It's not like you're talking about, I don't know, quantum non-locality.
Yeah.
It's not something highly abstract in that way. This is rather something that, like, politics at the end of the day, coming from ancient Greece, is how do we live amongst each other, and we all have to, for better or worse, live amongst each other. So
Yeah, I think, and I do, I don't like dumb down my videos per se, but I don't shy away from using academic language, but when I do try and explain it in more layman's terms, because I think there's a general, it's not an inability to comprehend. It's not that people are like unable to, or they're not intelligent enough to do so. It's more just like they're not equipped. They don't have the right equipment or tools to necessarily do so. That's the problem. They're not, if they had the tools and resources to do so, that's not the problem. The problem is just they might need like a hand or a bit of a guiding path. And typically that's where like university and high school even is. Like they try and funnel students down this path of learning about big nebulous topics. And that's kind of what I try and do as well. Like, I don't shy away from the academic language or using the literature or whatever. And I guess sometimes that can come across as ivory tower and ivory tower-esque and whatever. But I do agree with you, is that like intentionally dumbing it down to the point where it loses a lot of meaning just to kind of appeal to the lowest common denominator it's just bigotry of low expectations. And I think that I don't want to engage in that. I want to treat people like they're adults, like they're ready to learn, ready to understand, ready to disagree. Like that's what I want to do.
yeah, that people can can think critically. Yeah, man, that was a good tangent actually. I'm glad that we discussed that. So all right, man, back to the nuclear stuff, right? Okay, your video essay, the nuclear power fallacy. Can you just at a high level? Obviously, I'll leave a link to it in the show notes. But at a high level, can you just lay down your argument? And then secondly, this is the part I really appreciated. While you're not in principle not anti-nuclear, why would you say, like, for Australia, especially given how our country is geographically and landmass-wise and so on, nuclear just isn't a viable option?
So we are obviously the reason why we are even talking about any kind of energy transition is because we are in the midst of a climate crisis. And with that in mind, we need to come up with solutions that are comprehensive, that fundamentally change how we distribute energy, how we arrange energy, how we produce energy in a timely manner that avoids the 1 point. I mean, we're not going to avoid 1.5, avoids the 2-degree mark, hopefully by 2100. With that said, nuclear, I think, has some degree of utility. I think Germany's decision to phase out their nuclear completely was a wrong decision. in the grand scheme of things, particularly when, the recent forays into Russian gas or whatever. I think in Australia, it's not feasible because, well, for one, there's no kind of commercial precedent. So already, like, it's just if we're talking in a timely manner, renewables already have like a decade or two on nuclear. So in terms of like getting it done on time, it just makes sense to continue with the renewable stuff, right?
Yeah.
In terms of the resources itself, Australia is one of like probably the best place in the world to produce and harness renewable energy. We've got literally everything. We've got the best hydro, the most sun, the most wind. I'm pretty sure we've even got geothermal capabilities. We've got an incredible ability to use biofuels or biomass. Like we've got everything, and we have the ability to become a renewable energy exporter as well. I think there was one study I read ages ago that said that if Australia fully harnessed its potential renewable output, we could produce 500% of our renewable energy needs, which means we could export 400% overseas, which would be very important for countries like Indonesia, who still very much rely on coal. So in terms of feasibility in the current commercial environment and the abundance of renewable resources, it just makes sense to pick renewables. But again, like, that's not being principally against nuclear. I think China is doing some interesting things with thorium. I think France is a decent example of a long-term nuclear power grid. So it's not all bad, although France does have its problems with its nuclear fleet. So it's not all bad.
France, right? Yeah,
France.
Yeah, you mentioned that in the video too, I think.
Yeah. The other thing with nuclear is that it retains baseload power as like the way, like, baseload, medium load, and then peak load is like the way we do energy in our system, in our grid. It's a very archaic, very old, and it's worked well, way of distributing energy. You kind of have one kind of central point, and then you just kind of belt it out to the rest of the country. What we're finding now with more renewable oriented systems is that it's actually more advantageous to have a more regionalized, decentralized kind of an electricity network, where, let's say this is making it bigger than what it actually would be, but just for the sake of simplicity, let's say it's windy in South Australia and it's not very sunny in Victoria. So instead of relying on solar power, you bring in the wind from South Australia. And then when it's not windy in South Australia, maybe you can use hydropower from Tassie, and then also it may be sunny again in Victoria. And there's been research on this, where when it's not sunny in Victoria, it is sunny in Queensland. When it's not sunny in New South Wales, it is sunny in this place. Like, there's been research where no matter at what point in time, there will always be somewhere close by that is, in Australia at least, sunny, windy, whatever, when one place in particular isn't able to suffice those needs. So having a more regionalized and decentralized network, I think anyway, would be a really interesting and really good way to pursue a more energy efficient and resource efficient future, which again is necessary to not just solving the climate crisis, but also the ecological crisis the many ecological crises that we're facing, with ever increasing growth, ever increasing expansion. So that's kind of the more big abstract kind of problem with nuclear. But that, again, we're dealing with a climate crisis here. Immediacy is key. And so again, I'm not principally against nuclear, but in Australia, I think it's just not the best option to go for.
Well put. Yeah, I mean, I've got nothing really to add on to that. Watch the video. I think you cover everything there, and then go and read up on the resources you do share too. Beautiful. Thanks, Aju.
And it's obviously and just to add real quick as well, it's obvious to say the coalition's plans are just bunk. Like, it's just like a way to like prolong the renewable transition and keep coal and gas in the system, and maybe they'll build it's just I think it'll end up very similarly to the UK Conservatives' attempt at pivoting to nuclear. I think it'll be just not very effective, and really just prolongs the usage of coal and gas. So yeah, in terms of practical policy application in Australia, yeah, no, definitely not.
Yeah, in fact, can you just add, like, you mentioned in the video too, why like all these oil companies are actually pro-nuclear,
Yep.
and
Yeah.
what the kind of how cynical that is.
Oh yeah, it's so weird to see like um pro-nuclear campaigns being funded by like coal miners and stuff like that. What renewable what renewable energy transition effort or movement has been funded by um you know, the
Coal
people
mine.
who,
Yeah.
yeah. I guess you had Just Stop Oil that had that allegation or whatever, that an oil company was behind it. I'm not sure how true that was, but um they weren't specifically calling for renewable transition, but anyway. Or anyway. Um but yeah, it was weird to see that so many nuclear, so much media about nuclear, so many organizations were actually just backed by the fossil fuel lobby. You don't see that nearly to the same degree in the renewable sector. You might have the odd one out, but yeah, not nearly. And it's such a weird concerted effort, which I think points to the fact that they know that nuclear is not a sustainable option in Australia.
Yes, yes. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just, you know, the Liberals coalition and all these mining companies, the more they can stall, the more we don't transition, the better it is for them. So they create the spectacle, we debate, we have all these quote unquote discussions which go nowhere, and then nothing really happens.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, or as you, so the next one I want to discuss is this wasn't actually a video essay, but you did this debunking video to this some person, I don't know who that was, as it's called the mass immigration crisis is pushing Australia to collapse. Obviously, like the rest of the Western world, there is a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. It's quite unfortunate, like especially Indian migrants are copying it pretty badly. I see online
Hmm.
that it's actually quite vile.
Oh, it's terrible. Yeah.
Um, and so, can you talk a bit about just at a high level, where is Australia at when it comes to migration, and do we really have this sort of mass immigration crisis as we see more from the right?
So in that particular video and in the mass immigration crisis push, it was a response video to this guy kind of coming up with this grand conspiracy that um, the Labor government is importing all these immigrants because they can't manage the economy, and so they need to import all these workers to artificially keep GDP up, and they're putting them all in the NDIS, which is this big slush fund where no one works and does anything. Um, that's the big grand conspiracy. Oh, and then they're all going to these like ghost colleges and ghost universities, so they're actually not students. It's just a big conspiracy. And I think, and unfortunately, there are kernels of truth, like every conspiracy. But those kernels of truth do get taken advantage of. So, is there a problem with ghost colleges and ghost universities? Absolutely. Is there a problem with university, university students who look like university students on record, then dropping out like a semester later and just disappearing? Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. There's a problem with that. And I think there was a recent report in the Australian that said that 50% of Queensland University of Technology students that were foreign dropped out that year,
And where
or
did they go? Yeah.
dropped out in one semester. Is there a problem with that? Absolutely. Is there a problem with like the NDIS and corruption and criminality and fraud? Yeah, absolutely. But to kind of then like grab onto these things and then make this like a grand national conspiracy and crisis and the root of our economic problems is just completely unfounded. Um, so there are, to kind of succinctly put it, there are localized problems. Think of it like robo debt, right? Where people were getting automated debt notices from the government when they actually shouldn't have been, and then there was a the consequence was that some people committed suicide. That is a crisis. That is a problem. But it's not like you know, it's not like a problem that is causing the system to fail. It's not like a nationwide structural problem that's like responsible for our country's woes. Um, so you have like these, and you have these localized problems, and more often than not, what you find is that they're the result of the profit motive. They're the result of privatization, commercialization, where the NDIS is subsidizing a private market. It's not. It's just public money going into a private market. That's what it's doing. Now, I did a video on the NDIS, and it goes into a bit of the weeds, but essentially that's what it is. It's a non-market sector. It's a non-government. It's funded by the government, but it's classified as a non-market sector, which, you know, in reality, these providers are driven by profit. Um, and the same in the university sector. The
Yeah.
university sector is driven by profit, right? So it's going to do what's most profitable. But focusing the antagonism on immigrants is missing out on that bigger picture about profit, the profit motive, right? You can bring in all these immigrants, you can bring in these students and not have these problems if you just focus and talked about the profit motive, because the profit motive isn't just responsible for these problems in immigration. It's responsible for a bunch of other things like the underpayment and wage theft en masse of university professionals, right? Or university tutors. Um, so again, it's kind of taking advantage of these kind of local, relatively small but still serious crises in our country, and kind of trying to draw this big grand conspiracy where there isn't one. And I think it's quite silly.
Yeah, of course. I mean, again, obviously, as a migrant here, I'm not like anti-migration, but like any nation, we need to have controlled migration. But then it's just the most convenient scapegoat, just like trans people or just
Mm.
like woke, isn't it? Just to say, oh, it's the outsider that's creating problems in our, if not cohesive, peaceful nation, which we all know isn't the case. There's never, no nation has ever been cohesive, peaceful, and whole. Every society has their own antagonisms. And then on your point, on the university being a degree mill, yeah, I mean, this whole P's get degrees mindset, it's first of all an insult to education because it's just people are just there to get a piece of paper to either get a job or to convert that into some kind of like residency in Australia. But then is that really the purpose of a university? Is just to create more employees for the neoliberal system? What a sad state of affairs if all an education entails is just becoming a cog in the machine.
Yeah, these people focus on the immigrant part of it. They don't focus on the behavior that then takes advantage of the immigration system. We can have the immigrants. The immigrants, if you got rid of the immigrants, the behavior and systems and institutions and structures that exist right now, they're still there. And you'll see that bad behavior and that those negative consequences materialize elsewhere just because immigration is part of that right now. It doesn't mean that the problem is immigration per se. We can have these immigrants and also have a functioning university sector or a functioning NDIS. So again, it's not necessarily the immigrants. If you got rid of the immigrants, if you got rid of the immigrants out of the equation, you wouldn't solve those fundamental, real, incentives and problems embedded within these institutions that may or may not take advantage of our current immigration system. So yeah, I think that's my general like that's again, it's the same thing with housing, right? It's like, do immigrants put pressure on house prices? Yeah, but if you get rid of immigrants, you're still going to have this system that's fundamentally geared towards price growth, investment, speculation, which is embedded in 70% or less or slightly less of the population being homeowners and banks trading off the confidence of that. It's like, sure, you got rid of one like facet, but you're focusing all this pressure and angst towards that one bit without actually talking about or really discussing or seeking to get rid of the fundamental problem and the genesis of all our problems here. So
Indeed.
again, it's just, and again, we can have our current housing system or not. We can have enough houses for people and the amount of immigrants coming in. We can do that. We just need to change how we do it. We need to change our system. And I think that'll be both beneficial for us to change our system and beneficial for the people coming here. So it's just the wrong place to, put our foot forward, I think.
Yeah, and regarding housing, mate, like case in point is COVID. I mean, during COVID, no one came in here, but house prices still went up. How did that happen?
Well, the argument there is that because the Reserve Bank engaged in quantitative easing, which is a
Oh,
fancy way of saying expanding the money supply, it basically created an excessive amount of credit in the economy, and so people could, invest more in real estate. However, I think the extent to which people owe how do I say this? People say, "Oh, look, well, we printed all this money during COVID, and so that's why house prices went up." And it's like, yeah, that's true, but the reason why the Reserve Bank engaged in quantitative easing is because if it didn't, there may have very, very well been a significant decline in the real estate market. And particularly following 2019, I'm pretty sure in 2019 there was a market correction. If you had a sustained and substantial fall in real estate prices, particularly coinciding with a global pandemic and induced recession, you could really have a serious financial problem on your hands. And so one way to do that is to keep asset prices high by, quantitative easing the money supply.
And this again is your initial point, because it's tied up. The Australian economy is tied up to this quote-unquote asset called housing.
And so if you get rid of the immigrants, the economy will find a way to continue to prop up the market, because if it doesn't, it is going to collapse, right? And if the housing market collapses and the economy collapses, you'll have far, far more problems than we do today with the quote unquote excessive amount of immigrants we have in the country. You have far more problems. So just focusing on the immigrants ignores the fact that our system will find ways, our governments will find ways, the Reserve Bank will find ways to continue increasing the value of property prices, generally speaking, to avoid really big corrections to the point that it would cause a collapse in the housing market, because that would be catastrophic. And instead of focusing on that fact that, okay, we are either doomed to continual housing unaffordability or an economic collapse, like that's a up system. Why are we focusing on the immigrants? Why is it that one facet that we're focusing on? That's kind of my attitude, I think.
Nah, well put. I couldn't have put it better myself. All right, man. So I just realized, man, this is a great conversation, bro. Like I totally lost track of time, and it's 6:00. Are you okay to go for another 20 minutes, maybe?
Yeah, 20 minutes is fine. Yeah.
Legend, thanks, man. Because like I really have 3 more really important questions I want to ask you, and
yeah, no, you're all good.
I'd regret it if I don't get the chance to ask you that. All right, man. So from a lot of your videos, I think my favorite one was the decommodify housing essay. However, I'd say the second, or competing with that, was this one, the Great Australian Lie. It was a very interesting kind of sociological piece, but also philosophical, because I think a lot of these questions, again, comes down to identity. I mean, people, we live in a secular society, and I think this is a symptom of modernity, really. Nietzsche, God is dead, right? So,
yeah.
And then there's this groundlessness to our existence, and I think here's where really existential philosophy becomes really interesting. And we're like, okay, what is identity? So people try to find it in religion or nation, or even like the whole LGBTQ thing is people looking for identity, trying to find an identity in their gender or sexuality. And in this video essay in particular, The Great Australian Lie, you kind of talk about what is, like, you touch on what is Australian identity. I'm not even sure how to ask this question, but I'll just put it just crudely in that way. Like, what for you is Australian identity? And then can you talk about what you touched on in this essay, The Great Australian Lie?
Look, I think any kind of attempt to describe the Australian identity really just devolves into like empty platitudes about mateship and camaraderie and that kind of shit, which, like, find a country that doesn't have mateship, like, far out. I think, look, you can go into particulars about like accents and behaviors and norms and stuff like that. I think, I think people identify under Australia mostly because it's where they live and it's where they grew up, and there are pieces of media and there are pieces of things of cultural significance that fall under that banner, but aren't necessarily Australian. And people have those commonalities. So whether it be like TV shows or food or whatever, like, people have those commonalities where they can express a similar experience and maybe bond over that. And I think like when you can bring up a specific examples, so like anything from like Vegemite to like watching Nickelodeon or whatever, like or a Cartoon Network or whatever. Like I think that's what that kind of again, it's really hard to kind of talk about what is an Australian without kind of devolving into these kind of platitudes. So yeah, I really struggle to answer that question succinctly in a way which I feel like is intellectually honest. Not because I don't think I can give those kind of easy answers, but I think yeah, to be intellectually honest and really like go into it, it just kind of it does devolve into these kind of like socially constructed uh, sayings and euphemisms, like mateship and whatever. So
Yeah, I mean, I would just add something here before you get to your video part. It's just like I would say I too can't answer that question. One thing I would say for sure, it's multiculturalism. Absolutely, it's a multicultural country. It's a beautiful thing for me personally. Is that one thing we're not is we're not like a Christian nation or any of that, because I've seen a lot of people now say we are a country built on Judeo-Christian values.
well, what fucking Jews? Like, come on.
I don't know what are you talking about. So completely bringing the right wing, American Republican talking points, just porting it
Yeah.
to Australia. Like, what are you talking about? Or like, anyway. So I would say that's one thing we're not. I mean, clearly look at the country. I don't see any of that.
Um, I think yeah, but even like when you say multiculturalism, when you unpack what that means, it's like we really have a spotty relationship as a country with multiculturalism,
True, true.
particularly when we had like a period where we did try to homogenize the population into a singular Australian identity, which the video kind of does go over. Um, so again, like even when you say multiculturalism, I think for sure it makes up a big part of our story historically and today. But um, yeah, I don't know. I don't. This is this is like maybe this is my you know lack of belief in nationalism coming through, because I really do think that people, when you break it down, it's really just about shared common experiences, and like their relationships with people that live in their local community. That's really what people feel like, and that's currently under the banner of Australian, right? There's very few people I feel like that like really identify with Australian history or like Australian platitudes, really, right? I think the vast majority of people just like their local community, like their friends, like that they have shared experiences that have a geographical that they have certain common things that they can share, whether it be like geography or TV shows, culture, that kind of stuff. I really think it just comes down to that. I don't think there's like this nebulous notion of a nation in people's minds that connects all of us.
Indeed, indeed. And also, nothing wrong with that at all. As in, like, if you find your identity not this with this abstract platitude, but rather just within your. In fact, I would say that's preferable. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
If you find your me, because I do believe that human beings fundamentally, identity for us is it's a fundamental metaphysical problem. We can never get over it. It's a ongoing struggle in being human.
Yeah.
However, if you do find your identity in your community, in your local immediate community, I mean, I can't think of anything better than, I don't know, finding it within a political party or some abstract nation notion of a nation, which generally leads to something like fascism.
Yeah. It's not to
So,
say that people aren't proud. I think the majority of the population like that they're Australian, that they're proud to be Australian. But
I
what I
concur.
mean, like, but when you break it down, what that actually means to most people, I don't think it's like this nebulous notion of a nation, or like, oh, I'm proud of this country's history. It's just the fact that they've grown up here. They've had shared history and shared culture with the people they've grown up with. They can express commonalities. Like, I really think when you break it down to that when you break down what actually it means to be Australian to most people, that's what it is. I don't think it's this idea of a nation. And that's different to a lot of countries. So like, you know, a lot of national independence movements, they did have that kind of nationalist bent, right? We were speaking about like Gaza and that, like a lot of the Palestinian nationalism and like that's kind of brought them together. This kind of shared struggle, right?
Mm,
This nation that's been subjugated to under apartheid by Israel. Like that's something I think an example of nationalism, bringing people together and being that commonality in and of itself. But I think in countries like Australia, that's just not the case. I don't think that's the case at all.
Yeah, I mean, also, so to get back to the video, The Great Australian
Yeah, yeah,
Life,
yeah.
one beautiful point you make is that, like, yeah, like we have this picture again coming from the conservatives and the right, is that like Australia was in the back in the day was a whole, it was this beautiful nation with no
Cohesive unit. Yeah.
cohesive unit. Everything was functioning like a well oiled up machine. And then the woke people or the migrants or the trans people or the feminists came and ruined it all. But then the point you make is that this idyllic, this never existed really.
Yeah, no, it's this idea that, we had this homogenous block of people that came together and all believed in this national project. It's a bunch of, that's just not what happened at all. It's
Propaganda
completely
ideology.
ahistorical. It's propagandistic. It's ahistorical, and it's interesting. It's propagandistic, in the same way that local elites back then were trying to portray the nation. They were trying to be like, oh, we're one Australian people. We're one white Australian people in particular was the phrase. Yeah, and it was bullshit back then. It's bullshit today. It was not the case at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
The video, I mean, like I'm sure people would like to watch the video, but in the video I talk about not only the class conflict that was, so prevalent in colonial Australia, but also the racial, like inter-European racial conflict, not just between Europeans and Chinese or Indian people, but also between Europeans, like Irish and English people, who literally thought each other as different races, sent their kids to different schools, like
Bizarre.
like didn't employ Irish people, didn't employ Protestants. Like, yeah, bizarre, right? And you had similar scare campaigns about Irish people in the media that you do today about like Sudanese people in Melbourne. You had there was one particular case in like in 1877 or something, and it was like a band of Irish guys from Waterloo, which was a working class Irish suburb back in the day, you know, came and raped this young Protestant girl, and it was a media shitstorm. It was like it was used as justification for, cracking down on Irish organizations, and it was used in a very, very similar way that Sudanese crime today is used as a method, as a means to systemically discriminate against them. But obviously today we don't see Irish people in that respect at all.
Yeah.
It's so weird that only 100 or so years ago they were literally considered different races, animalistic foreigners. Like it is so disparate to what, even like what's taught in schools. The conception that Australia was this like neatly built homogenous block. Yeah, it's just so divorced from the truth.
Yeah, man. I mean, look, here's where, again, to touch on the previous point about not being condescending, like, I think people should just read more. Like, like stop being lazy and like read a book, read a bit of history, do a audiobook podcast, because it's like, you'll see how silly and stupid these notions of like race and, cultural cohesiveness, all these ideas are. I mean, if there's one thing that's probably consistent in human history, it is the fact that things rarely do work out, in the sense that there's always some malfunctioning in society. And in a way, it does give you a bit of relief, because then you realize, okay, we're not in a unique shitstorm right now. We
Yeah.
can, it's always been pretty bad. That doesn't mean you just sit down and do nothing. However, it helps, again, like kind of what we discussed, to get a
Bit
bit
of
of
solace.
context.
Yeah.
Yeah, and indeed. So yeah, I mean, and here I would even say read a bit of philosophy, like understand how bizarre the notion of even identity is, how identity works. Like when, for example, when the right wing makes these stupid things about, oh, what is a woman? Like, shut the up, man. I mean, just get out of here, Anyway, all right, man. So, just I think the final few questions in the interest of time. Thanks a lot for going over time, bro. Really appreciate
Yeah, of
it.
course. Yeah.
That with the upcoming election, I guess I want to kind of discuss preferential voting, and if it makes sense to, vote number one for a minor party. Would doing that be throwing away your vote, or do you think that can create some space for something like a genuine left-wing movement, not in this, obviously, the imminent election, but rather sometime in the future?
I think that to answer the first question, no, it's not throwing a vote away. We have a preferential voting system, which is much different to the US, where you can number on a sheet specifically who you want to get in. So number one, you want this person to get the most. Number two, okay. Number three, Number four, number five, boo, right? And that ensures that people's first preferences, you're able to vote for who you really want to get in, but also make sure that in a realistic scenario, when it's between two major parties, the one you prefer to rule over the country. However, minor parties have grown to the point, like the Greens, where they've begun to win overall outright the in first preferences. So they've been able to get 50% of the first preference vote, meaning they win the seat. So absolutely, I think people should do that. And the reason why is that by themselves, major political parties, governing political parties, they only respond to external influences. Yep. Very rarely do they respond to the rank and file. And honestly, the rank and file a lot of the time is just like, kind of passively involved in upholding and maintaining the party bureaucracy at the top. There'll be a lot of Labor rank and file people upset at me for that, but generally speaking, political parties react to external influences. They react to push and pull from the outside, and particularly in recent years, we've seen those external influences from the ruling elite, from the ruling classes, consolidate and become more concerted and powerful in their ability to lobby and affect how governments behave. Now, they do this through a number of ways. Donations is obviously one big way. Lobbying is one big way. There was a report done by the Grattan Institute specifically about how many lobbyists have just like free reign over where they go in Parliament with no record collection. Like, they can just go in whenever they want. Go into an MP's office, do whatever. Punters Politics has done a good video on that. The Grattan Institute has a good report on that. So yeah, donations, lobbying, media campaigns, so scare campaigns. So obviously the big example of that was when Kevin Rudd tried to institute the mining tax. It got knocked back because the mining industry was like, we don't want to pay that tax. We're going to oust you from government. They spent like $20 million on ads getting Rudd to be ousted by his own party. And then the second Gillard got on a plane, met in a meeting room with a bunch of mining execs, devised the new minerals resource tax, which was ridden with loopholes that they could take advantage of. So
terrible.
There are numerous, There are numerous ways in which external influence can really pressure governments, and particularly in our day and age, that comes, unfortunately, from the top. Now, what minor parties do are they are those external influences, and in respect to the Greens, they can be those more progressive, more grassroots orientated, pulls on the major parties. So in this regard, it would be the Labour Party, and we saw that in the Gillard term, ironically, where the Gillard government was the most productive prime minister. Julia Gillard was the most productive prime minister in Australian history, and instituting things like the NDIS, Gonski, all this stuff, right? And of course, there are limits there because Gillard was still limited by the external influences, not just the Greens, but those big mining companies that got her in a room and got her to write a really nice new tax law, or even the media. So it's not as if it's a be all and end all, but it's just one lever we can pull and be, okay, vote for a minor party. Maybe they'll get more say in the government. They'll be able to, be a thorn in the side of the government. And that could, produce some marginal, but, potentially positive change. And we've even seen this with the Albanese government. So the right to disconnect, for example, that was, it was organised and promoted by the unions. It was brought about by the Greens in Parliament. It was a Greens amendment. Yeah. So that's one really positive thing. The amendments to the safeguard mechanism, which made it more I forget. Was it removing the cap on emissions that it would? Anyway, it was something. It was one amendment that really limited the safeguard mechanism, and the Greens basically negotiated with the Labor Party to get rid of it and make it more effective. And this is the one people point to as like a negative example, but the Housing Australia Future Fund, initially when Labor first tabled it in Parliament, its disbursement cap, so cap, not limit, not floor, its disbursement cap was $500 million a year. When the Greens, and the crossbench negotiated with Labor, that cap became a funding floor. So it was a minimum $500 million a year, regardless of the returns of the future fund. And then obviously you have the additional direct injections into social and affordable housing. So I think it totaled up to $3 billion in additional total spending outside of the half that came from that debacle. So overwhelmingly, the relationship between the Greens and Labor has been one that's positive and progressive. Now, the obvious problem is that the Greens invest a bunch of time, effort, labor, resources into organizing that, and just to have that kind of small blip, right? And it's not immeasurable, it's there 100%, and it's useful, but I think it's just, these are just marginal policy tweaks that get Labor to act better, but ultimately don't really address some of the more fundamental concerns that even the Greens may have. These are ultimately quite small tweaks, and ultimately if the Greens do achieve some greater amount of power, they ultimately will suffer the same form of external pressures that the governing Labor Party would in the name of concerted industry coming and putting their foot down. And we saw this in the Whitlam government. The Whitlam government, quite initially a pretty progressive government in the 70s, once there was a bunch of backlash from business, and once the trade union effort kind of died down a bit, it really conservatized rapidly. It cut money from social spending. It started focusing on wage claims and not price hikes. It really started to conservatize dramatically. Ashley Lavelle has a good book on it called Opposition Vanishing. But that kind of trap where the Greens, there's no mechanism for the Greens to rise above that trap. So while they're a good kind of, force to tinker and push for change marginally, I think ultimately I'm not a big fan of parliamentary change. I think we need to build the things we want to see tomorrow in the society today. We need to do that outside of Parliament. And if we want Parliament to do something, we need to exert our influence and put our foot down, withdraw our labor, withdraw our resources, and say, if you don't do this thing, Parliament, we're gonna go on strike. That kind of vibe. So, I think if we want to, I think the best way to create the change we want to see is to produce it and reproduce it in our lives right now. So whether that be decommodifying housing, right? In that video, I talk about not relying on the government, right? Having our own separate kind of sector insulated from the government.
And you even point at some practical examples where this has already been done.
Yeah, so the examples in that video, I think, was Germany and in different European countries. There was also Uruguay as well, though Uruguay did rely more on the state. It had a public land bank and it had a dedicated task force of professionals helping people. But in Germany, they've been a bit more autonomous in that regard. And they're practicing the change they want to see. And I think doing that en masse, producing a new society in the current, is the way to kind of go forward, to prefigure the new society in the current society. I think that's the most powerful way to affect change. So
yeah. I mean,
that's my view.
My take from that was voting is just one thing you do, one of many, and probably even not even that high in terms of impact and
absolutely
and creating change. Yeah, no, thanks for that. And
I'm not I'm not anti-voting or anything. I think people should vote. I think there's benefits to voting, and I think there's benefits to having progressive governments in power. But centering your political your theory of change or your understanding of politics on electoralism to me just is misguided given the last, I don't know, however many hundreds of years of liberal democracy we've had, or capitalism with limited democracy we've had.
Yeah.
So
Excellent.
I think,
Yeah. Well, yeah, I
that's
mean,
kind of my view.
yeah, no, I mostly agree. I mean, yeah, democracy is democracy, right? What can we say? I mean, there's probably a reason that all philosophers have been against democracy to a certain, in some way, but it is what we're what we have to deal with, or what we're given at the moment, at least. But I certainly concur. And again, your example with like alternate systems of housing, like in Germany, for instance, what they've done away from the commodified market's a really solid example of how we can build alternate systems while also still being a part of the system, because you can't really remove yourself from the system fully. That's
And it's not just limited to housing as well. It's housing is just one specific thing that I've hyper focused on and that I'm a bit more well read on. But this extends to not just housing, but the workplace, home, friends, family, that kind of stuff. Like this extends, like building what you want to see tomorrow in all parts of your life. Housing is just obviously one big part of it, but one aspect of that.
indeed. All right, Aju, on the last question on that note. So, sorry if it's like a cliche, stupid question, but how do you think with the upcoming election, it's okay, I'll put it this way, right? I feel like in this conversation, because you and I mostly agree on everything pretty much politically and certainly more like philosophically, I think, when it comes to politics, we've kind of taken the approach where whoever that's listening to us would probably agree with us, right? But like, let's say someone watches this video who would consider themselves to be a centrist or perhaps even on the right, whoever that person is, in what way would you say should people be approaching this upcoming election?
I think, look, I think Dutton's a bit of a threat. I think that's something worth reckoning with. I do think, though, treating it like a be all and end all, it's not going to end Australia one way or the other. I think Albanese has a better vision than Dutton, even if it's marginally better. So, look, I think come into the election understanding that current governments, current institutions, they're not equipped and not willing to really address the problems, the fundamental problems that you may see in society today, but that one stripe, one blend of that apparatus marginally manages it better, and you should probably vote for that blend that marginally manages it better, because you don't have to stop struggling and working for a better society if you voted Labour. Like that, you don't have to stop doing that. You should keep doing it. You'll just be operating in marginally better conditions. That's all. So,
yeah.
I think treat it like it is. It's not this be all and end all. Country's going to go to shit, or just decline into fascism or whatever. But at the same time, treat it with respect. It's something worth considering. Take some time out of your day, but don't expect that it's going to revolutionize things. Don't buy this thing that the major parties or even minor parties are going to really, really change society, because they won't. Having that hope, I think, is setting yourself up for failure. Putting all your eggs in this electoral basket, it's you're just going to end up more disenfranchised and more disappointed.
Yeah, be judicious about it. I mean, like, just get the perspective that voting, it's just one of the things you do, probably even isn't even necessarily that important. It's still, in fact, here I even agree with the fact that in Australia we have mandatory voting. Like, I'm a fan of that to the most part. But as you beautifully put, there are many other things we can do towards a better society. Mate, thank you so much, man. I've learned a lot from your videos, but of course,
thank you.
This conversation too. A few things. I think for me, generally, what happens is when I re-listen to these things, I go and look up the stuff you mentioned, the sources, all of that. So that's where my real education takes place.
Yeah.
But on top of that, man, just stellar, superlative video essays. Both the quality,
Thank you.
the way you present them, the research. I mean, I don't know how you do it. Like the amount of reading you probably have to do. I mean,
Oh, stop it. Don't be
you
silly.
probably have no life, man. I'm joking. But,
Oh,
so
if I had no life, I'd be able to do way more. I wish I had no life, like
yeah, I
some of these other
agree.
people, because there'd be so much more output. I'm so behind schedule and everything on in this front. So unfortunately, I do have a life. That
That
does.
sucks, doesn't it? Having a life isn't that easy. I know. Tell me about it. I know. I wish I had no life.
um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it would make this a bit easier. But no, seriously,
Yeah.
thank you so much. You very
Oh, cheers,
flattering.
bro. Yeah, and again, man, I'm glad that I caught you before you blew up because I think eventually the algorithms are gonna catch on to your kind of content, and with that quality, it's gonna get there. But yeah, man, I'll let you know when this is out.
Yeah, it's so easy.